Fed Chair Jerome Powell is between a rock and a hard place, if there was ever a definition for it, with his upcoming Jackson Hole meeting as well as the Federal Reserve's joint meeting in September to decide what's going to happen with the federal funds rate. The federal funds rate has been a large topic of discussion around whether or not it should be lowered or we should keep rates the same to combat inflation. I'm going to walk you through where we're at in the decision he has to make, as well as an unforeseen new wrinkle in the firing of the BLS's commissioner. The new replacee, appointed by Donald J. Trump, AJ Antoni, had some takes on the quarterly jobs report itself that we're going to cover. But first, I want to get you up to speed on this gentleman. This is Jerome Powell, and he is the chair of the Federal Reserve. Now, he was appointed in 2017 by Donald Trump, and he is given two mandates. His first mandate is to keep the job market strong, to keep it resilient. And so here we have the number that they reference most usually, the U3 unemployment rate. Now, this is not measuring underemployed. This is not counting anything like job losses or anything. This is strict surveys that come out of the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. And we can see that the trend line for this ever since July of 2024, June of 2024, has sat in around 4.1 to 4.2, only dipping to 4.0 once at the beginning of the year. This number has remained pretty remarkably stable over the last year, and the Federal Reserve would agree that they are indeed keeping the job market stable. The other mandate that the Federal Reserve has is to keep prices stable for the average everyday consumer. They measure this via what's called the CPI index, which I have in front of you, which measures things like food, energy, electricity, clothing, shelter, new vehicles, gasoline, food in the home and away from home, natural gas piped into the home, services without energy, medical care, education. All of these items have some form of importance in the core lifestyle of being an American. And so what they do is they culminate this basket of goods that I believe contains over 20,000 items that they're measuring. And what they do is they see, are they more or less expensive than they were last year? Here I have food pulled up. We can look specifically and see that food prices are up 3% since this time last year, meaning in June of 2024, food prices were 3% less. Food away from home, we can see a similar trend, where food away from home has gone up 3.9%. We can look at the price of shelter, 3.7% up since last year. This is on a downward trend. That's a good sign. New vehicles starting to trend back up 0.4% only though since last year. And you get the gist. They culminate all these goods into what we get as the CPI index, or what we read as headline inflation. We have this sitting at 2.7%. We can see that the all-time high was reached back in June of 2022 at 9.1% year-over-year inflation. We see that we were getting 6s and 7s and 8s very regularly during this 2021 into 2023 timeframe. Only into 2024 do we start to see consistently below 4%, though as an update to the mandate, the Federal Reserve wants to see this number get below 2%. So they control, though, this rate. This is the federal funds rate, and I pulled this up for the last 5 years so we can see that they actually had the federal funds rate at 0 post-COVID. This has only happened a couple times before and is only used in drastic measures to help revitalize the economy. We had a dire economic scenario, a dire job market hiccup that happened with COVID, and the economy stalled, so they lowered rates to 0 to stimulate it. We can see that by 2022, they started to up rates at an alarming pace up until the summer of 2023. And this is when we would see mortgage rates hit 7, 6, and some people even clocked in low 8s as a mortgage rate. By September of 2024, a lot of people forget this, the Fed actually did start cutting rates. They made 3 rates altogether, one in November, one in December, and the first one starting in September, November, December. I know my months. I promise. I know my months. All 12 of them. We have the federal funds rate in front of us. This is the overnight exchange rate for banks. This is not the mortgage rate. Now, the mortgage rate is what most people are focused on here. They think lower rates, and you may think this as well. That's fine. Lower rates by the Fed mean lower rates for you and I, for a mortgage, for a car, for a credit card, for a boat, for whatever you want to finance. And to an extent, historically, that has been accurate. As we see the Fed rate, when they started to tick it up, as we see walking through 2023 into the summer, we saw these rates peak walking into the 6s, 7s, all the way up to 7.9 at one point. And if we go down from there, we see rates start to trickle down. But what happened, and this is key, when they made their cut in September. This is key. We have to lock this in because this has everything to do with the Fed rate's big decision. When they cut rates in September 2024, we can see that the 30-year mortgage rate had begun to plummet down from, at one point just a few months earlier, 7.22 for the average 30-year fixed rate mortgage, down to 6.08 after the first cut. But you will notice on the effective funds rate that they made 3 cuts, one in September, again, I know my months, October, and then again in December. Mid-December, we see that cut. So let's look at the exact same time frame on the 30-year mortgage. I'm going to pull this back to just last year. If we go back all the way to September, we see that as the first cut happened, the 30-year dropped in succession with it. But as we look into the months following, we see that in October, another rate cut month, the 30-year went up a full 500 basis points, eclipsing 80 basis points all the way up until November. We get another cut. We get a little bit of a drop, but then the December cut hits and they once again go up. So what's going on here? Why is one of the number one historical leading indicators of mortgage rates not tracking with mortgage rates? The federal funds rate almost always tracks directly in line with the 30-year mortgage. And this is something that needs to be brought up. Let's look at another graph, though, because some of you may be thinking, Zach, well, the Fed rate doesn't determine mortgages, bonds do. And you're absolutely right. So what I have pulled up here is the 30-year Treasury bond, and I want us to look at the same time frame together. So I want us to go back to where right here is pre-first cut in September. We saw rates were starting to dip for the 30-year Treasury yield. Now, this is the return biannually that investors will receive for holding government debt. And they have to hold this principal within this debt until the 30-year maturity wall, because this is a 30-year investment. You are investing in the 30 years worth of our economy being sustainable enough for our government to be able to pay you back on its debt. And so when we started to get that first cut, they priced in good things. But something strange happened is after that, investors actually weren't so pumped about the rate cut. In fact, as we saw more rate cuts come through in October, and then again in November, we saw that little cut, and then right back through December, they started to peak pre-cut levels. Look, this is pre-cut. This is August 30th. Before the 3 federal funds cuts, we were sitting at a 4.195. Post 3 cuts, as we enter the middle of January, we're all the way back up to 4.9. And if you look forward to today, we're just under that by 1 point at 4.827. Sorry, that's 10 points. I'm really bad with the basis points thing. I just always call them percentages. Call me a layman, but that's what I've always done. Now, here's the deal. Just because the 30-year is what you're focused on does not mean the Fed necessarily has control over it. That's what we're seeing as an argument in this data, that just because the federal funds rate comes down, that does not mean necessarily that the 10, 30-year Treasury yields will go down in succession with them. And that's a problem for the Fed. But regardless of that, people like from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, are calling for rate cuts and have been all summer. Starting in May, Mr. Bessent has been on the scene calling for a rate cut of at least 50 basis points, which would be half a full percentage. That would be taking the federal funds rate from where it is at 4.25 down to 3.75. And that was in a speech in an interview with Bloomberg. He actually called for a 150 basis point cut. This would spur a lot of credit being created if rates were to actually drop. But as we just showed, the rate dropping for the Fed might not necessarily, historically, yes, it means it, but right now it may not mean that mortgage rates actually come down, that bonds actually come down. And let me put it here plainly for you. For anyone wondering, why do we want lower rates? Why does the government want this? Well, the reason that Trump is outwardly pressuring this man from every single direction is mainly because the government has debt to pay. And the interest that they're going to be paying that debt on is a higher yield than a lot of the original debt that was issued at 2 and 3 and lesser percentage yields. So if you're following me here, the maturity wall for that cheap debt is upcoming and happening as we speak. So when they refinance this new debt, issue more bonds, issue more Treasury bonds, our debt package to investors, they're going to have to eat a bigger chunk in interest. And interest is becoming a bigger and bigger and bigger line item on our country's P&L sheet, profit and loss sheet. And Trump knows this. Trump has been in the Fed building. He's been on the phone with Mr. Jerome Powell. And none of the conversations seemingly have gone super well. One of the main pieces of drama that still exists is Trump threatening now a major lawsuit. And this is from this morning. If you're listening to this, thinking, hasn't this been going on all summer? It has been. But now we're thinking major lawsuit in response to the Federal Reserve building. But we see the subheadline here, which might be some of the subtext to this lawsuit. The U.S. president has pressured Powell to lower interest rates and criticized him for the Federal Reserve's renovation costs. Now, the renovation costs specifically have been linked down to apparently parking and asbestos. Originally, it was supposed to be like marble floors, and they were getting these French beehives. I don't even know what that is. And apparently, according to Jerome Powell and the board behind this, sorry for my headphone users, construction effort, is that it is not that and that they are structural. But Donald Trump and his administration are still calling BS. This is a truth from him, August 12th this year in the morning, 9:44 a.m. He says, Jerome, too late Powell, must now lower the rate. Steve Mnuchin really gave me a beauty. He puts that in quotations. So when he puts it in quotations, I feel it's said a certain way. Really gave me a beauty when he pushed this loser. The damage he has done by always being too late is incalculable. Fortunately, the economy is so good that we've blown through Powell and the complacent board. I am, though, considering allowing a major lawsuit against Powell to proceed because of the horrible and grossly incompetent job he has done in managing the construction of the Fed buildings. $3 billion for a job that should have been done at a $50 million fix-up budget. Added that budget word. Not good. Okay. The budget's $2.6 billion. It's not $3 billion. They're including a whole nother building that was completed about 5 years ago in 2019. So it's not $3 billion. The original budget was $1.9 billion. And we're seeing right here, he's saying $3 billion. The original billions was 1.9. And this was approved by his committee, the Arts Committee, in 2019 under Trump. His appointees approved this. Now, the budget has since ballooned to 2.4 and now $2.6 billion. Now, is there an argument for that's a misuse of funds? Yes, there is an argument for that. It's definitely an argument for that. But the problem is the way this is being portrayed. The way it's being portrayed is that the American taxpayer is being slapped in the face. Hundreds of millions of dollars, 600 million, 700 million, however many billion over budget. The American people deserve better use of their taxpayer funds. But the problem is the Federal Reserve is funding it themselves. They're actually not using taxpayer dollars. In fact, the renovations, I think I highlighted it here, but I just highlighted something else, so it went away. Let me read something for you. It says, while the Defense Department and other executive branches receive money from the Congress, the Fed is self-funded, largely via interest income from government securities it holds. That means no taxpayer dollars have been appropriated for Fed operations or renovations, including the building projects like the headquarters renovation. They hit it. Most of the Fed's income comes from assets such as Treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities that sit at the central bank's balance sheet and earn interest. Now, this is something new. If you're wondering, have we always, as a central bank, held essential CMBSs, residential mortgage-backed and commercial-backed securities, and Treasury bonds? And the answer is no, they haven't always. Quantitative easing and the ownership of these assets is actually something relatively new. So you would think, okay, they're swimming in money. They're giving the Treasury their cut, so our country's making money. That's great. And they're paying off the people that they owe interest. This all makes sense. They're making money off of this. They're paying into that. They're paying dividends to banks. But the problem is the money that they're paying to the banks is superseding what they're receiving in their returns. The Fed audited financial statements for 2024 showed that it suffered operating losses, 2024, of $77.6 billion. That's on the heels of losing $114.3 billion in 2023. That's a total of just under $200 billion. Now, you may be asking, what's the culprit to this? This article does a great job. I'll link all articles used in the description below. Large amounts of interest it pays on bank reserves. 2008, we restructured a lot, and one of those restructurings we made was around how banks, especially banks that are too big to fail, have to hold reserves. And those reserves get dividend payments on them from the Federal Reserve. So the Federal Reserve pays interest on the debt it's creating by issuing the ability to have dividends paid out for savings accounts being held with our central bank. Layman's term as I can. Now, what this means is they're now paying out more than they're taking in. So when you look at the argument for, are we really needing this multi-billion-dollar fix, there's a good argument that maybe the money that should be going to the Treasury, which, by the way, is what happens when we're in a surplus. We've always been in a surplus at the Fed. These are the only 2 years on record we've been in a deficit, and a significant one. I think there's a graph on here. Let's show this graph real fast. This is it right here. You see the net income since 2008, when they started doing this, has been pretty remarkable. 2023 and 24, very underwhelming. And that does give credence to the argument that maybe money should be better allocated. But the problem remains. They have a decision to make in September, and historically speaking, they have made cuts in similar conditions. Let me go back to, and this is the unemployment rate last year. When that rate cut was made, the unemployment rate was at 4.1. It bounced between 4.2 the month before and would peak back up, but again, very stable. And we sit today at 4.2. So we know they're okay with making cuts with unemployment being where it's at, even though they would say anything below 5% is considered fully employed and doesn't require any moves. But we have proof that they have. Also, we have proof that in times of inflation decline, that they are indeed willing to lower rates. So let me zoom us in real quick. This is going to be the end of 2021 and through today. Let's look at inflation when they made their move. So we see inflation really dropping off from 2022 into 2023. The summer is when that bad mortgage rate season began. Now, if I zoom in even closer to look at 2023 into today, we see that inflation pretty much was on a decline, having some ups and downs, but really hitting a slide down from 3.5 all the way down to 2.4% when that Fed rate decision was made. So with inflation being 2.5 in August and 2.4 when the decision came in for the rate cut, we actually don't have historical evidence to say that a rate cut can be made at 2.7. In fact, we've never historically made a rate cut at 2.7%. It's never happened. Now, to put a cherry on top of this conundrum Sunday, we have to go back into jobs. Jobs is just as important as inflation. There are two mandates: protect the job market, protect prices. But the job market has had some drama around it because the Bureau of Labor and Statistics, BLS, released a report stating the summer market for job creation was not nearly as good as we thought. We got all the survey data in, it's bad. And what Trump did, same day of that release in August, fired the commissioner, shot the messenger. The messenger gone and now replaced with AJ Antoni. AJ went on an interview the other day and said something pretty remarkable. He said what I believe a lot of economists actually would kind of agree with. He stated that the jobs data that's being released isn't partisan. It's just not a great system. And maybe instead of releasing it monthly, we could release it quarterly to make sure it's accurate. I think a lot of people thought that was a good idea, but he backed off, stating that after pressure that came from somebody else, that they're not going to do that. And until it is corrected, the BLS should suspend issuing the monthly jobs report. This was his initial statement, but keep publishing the more accurate, though less timely, quarterly data. Again, stating we shouldn't be releasing this monthly data that needs to be revised so often. Let's just revise quarterly or release quarterly when we don't have to make those revisions. Major decision makers from Wall Street to DC rely on these numbers, and a lack of confidence in the data has far-reaching consequences. I completely agree, but told to Danny Freeman, somebody else said, Mr. Moore, said, I think it's a bad idea. In fact, I've talked to EJ about this since, and he's not going to do it. We need monthly numbers. Now that he's talked about this, doing quarterly numbers thing, that's much more accurate than the monthly ones, and he's saying maybe, but he's backed off. We're going to continue to do monthly numbers. So this is going to be a system that continues to be kind of jacked, and the jobs market, for lack of a better term, is going to remain untracked. We're going to keep using U3 survey data from the BLS. We're going to keep using the same system for monthly releases that need to get revised. This has happened in 2024, happened in 2023, happened in 2022. Very, very common. It's not partisan. But we have to also look at the inflation goals alongside the job market goals. The job market goals is to keep unemployment below 5% according to U3. On the inflation side, supposedly, they're trying to get inflation below 2%. Now, could the goalposts have moved? Could we be seeking more of a 2.5 number than a 2% number like their mandate states? Their mandate very clearly states that they are seeking to make sure that the job market remains stable for you and I, and so too do prices. They say that the job market is maximally employed at sub 5%, and then inflation, especially due to tariffs that are incoming into our economy, we are very wary right now as to the impacts of future sticky inflation, and they want to curtail that. The problem is, if they were to lower rates, they could undo a lot of the work they've done for the last years to curtail it. So they're between a rock and a hard place, and the big problem is, and I'm going to touch on this in our next video, is that they probably shouldn't lower rates, but that the pressure from the outside will force it. The pressure from the outside, both politically and coming from economists, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, and others, is piling up. Questioners piling up. Even governors on the FOMC board stating maybe we should cut rates. But the problem is, historically, inflation has never been this high whilst cutting rates. So hear me. One thing we can see from the last time that we cut rates is that another thing also went up. Inflation also began to tick back up. Now, this did curtail itself and did decline slightly moving into Q1, but we saw exiting into Q2 that tariffs began to take hold. The question for the Federal Reserve is, do they believe this will remain, or that we've seen the peak of this inflation happen? It's already gone. It's already built in. Now let's build for the future. It could mean a lowering of rates, but I believe rates should honestly stay where they're at. I'll give my argument for that in the next video, but I want to give you a full breakdown, update of exactly what's going on with the Federal Reserve, exactly the happenings of our federal funds rate, and why it should matter, or maybe even not matter, to you. Next video, we'll tackle exactly what the Fed should do in September with its federal funds rate.